Good day, and today we're going to talk about World War I. In particular, we're going to look at some of the history between the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. But let's start off with a bit of the history. There were three main fronts in the war. First, there was the Western Front, which took place almost exclusively in France. Now, most of the trench warfare that is known from World War I took place here. Most of the fighting in this Western Front also took place between the French and the British on one side, and the Germans on the other. Now, this will lead to a stalemate on the Western Front for years, lasting until 1917. And a stalemate means neither side could force the other into surrendering. We also have the other two fronts. Since you have a Western Front, there was also an Eastern Front. Now, most fighting here was between the Germans and the Russians, with some involvement from Serbia and other nations trying to break free from imperial rule. Your third front is also the Italian Front. Most fighting here included Italy alongside the French against the German and Austro-Hungarians, and the very countries it had allied itself with at the beginning of the war. Now, we also see Russia withdrawing from the war in 1917, which had a major impact, as Germany then focused on the Western Front with a stronger potential for victory. So when we take a look at a modern-day map of Europe, we can see that we've got the different alliances here in red, in purple, and in gold. So when we start with the Triple Alliance, you have in the center Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And with those countries, you're going to form the fronts. In the Western Front, you're going to see the Triple Entente of Great Britain and France fighting that trench warfare that we see a lot of times in World War I movies and in other documentaries. However, there's also going to be the Italian Front on the south side of France against the Italians. The Western Front you're going to see is Germany and Austria-Hungary fighting against Russia with other countries such as Serbia who are trying to break away from the imperial rule of Russia. And then you have the neutral countries, the countries who might be giving support to the Triple Alliance, the Triple Entente, but they're not actively involved in the war. So in World War I, what was the spark that started this whole war? Well, that would usually be argued to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, the Duchess Sophie, at Sarajevo in Bosnia on June 28, 1914. So when we look again at our map, and we can see all of these smaller countries that are surrounded by your Triple Alliance and your Triple Entente, because we can see Germany in the upper left-hand corner, which means if we go all the way over to the right-hand side, you're going to start seeing Russia. We're down in the center bottom of our screen where we're in Herzegovina in Sarajevo, and that is where the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, the Duchess Sophie, happens. Now, Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was killed in Bosnia by a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand, and they believed that Bosnia should belong to Serbia. Well, this is going to create a domino effect. Austria blamed Serbia for Ferdinand's death and declared war on Serbia. Because there was a lot of alliances between the monarchies at the time due to intermarriage, due to several treaties that have been written over the past 100 or 200 years, because Austria now has declared war on Serbia, Germany then pledges their support for Austria-Hungary. On the opposite side, Russia is now pledging their support for Serbia. Now, Germany and Russia did not have any direct meaning or thoughts towards Archduke Ferdinand's death, but because Austria had a problem, Germany came in on their side. Because Serbia had a problem, Russia came in on the Serbian side. So once that happens, now Germany is going to declare war on Russia. Well, France is going to then pledge their support for Russia because of their ties to Russia, and therefore Germany is now going to declare war on France. And because they need to get to France, Germany now is going to invade Belgium on the way to France. Well, Great Britain supports Belgium, and therefore they're now going to declare war on Germany. There's this domino effect where we had just two nations getting into war, but because of where they are all aligned, whether it comes to alliances, whether it comes to monarchy marriages, or even because Belgium just happens to be in the way, all of these nations all of a sudden are drawn into the war. And that's where we get our powers, our triple entente, our triple alliance. They're also known as powers, such as the allied powers of Great Britain, France, and Russia. And your central powers, where we have Germany, and we've got Austria-Hungary, and we also have Turkey coming in as a central power as well. So why was World War I a stalemate for so many years? Again, what is a stalemate? Neither side can make a move to win. Neither side feels like they have to surrender or that they can claim a victory. We also see some technology is going to start creating a stalemate. Our machine guns that have now come into heyday and they become more common practice are mowing down a lot of soldiers. So now they have to take on a different type of battle tactic, and that would be to dig trenches. And so the way that war was fought before, people would line up their soldiers into lines and they would march forward for victory. But now with trench warfare, people had to dig. But before they did that, millions were dying without gaining any ground. So you see a stalemate on all fronts. There is also a problem on the Western Front with Russia because prior to World War I, Russians were discontent over the economic, political, and social issues concerning higher taxes, their poor working conditions, and their lack of political rights. Now, at the time of World War I, Tsar Nicholas II was losing popular support, and his authoritarianism was weakening his power. So by the time we get to 1917, in the midst of World War I, you see the Russian Revolution happening. Nicholas II was overthrown, and he and his heirs were executed. As a result, Russia withdraws from the war, and the British and French defenses on the Western Front were crucial in the final outcome of the war, and the Allies were now needed. Now, as Russia withdraws its support because of their having their own problems with the Russian Revolution, the US then enters the war on the same side as Russia, Great Britain, and France. Now, the US had declared neutrality at the outbreak of the Great War, but due to factors like, in 1915, the German U-boats sinking British passenger ships such as the Lusitania, which Americans were using, that brought American protests. And in 1917, they began sinking US merchant ships. And therefore President Woodrow Wilson asks the U.S. Congress to declare war on Germany in April of 1917. And then finally, the armistice of November 11th, 1918, ends fighting between the Allies and the Central Powers. So we take a look at some of the technology or some of the ways that war was happening in World War I. For example, on the Western Front, especially in France, you see trench warfare happening. Now, you can even see in trench warfare where the men not only living in them, but they also would then come out of their trenches in order to try and gain ground. So even though trench warfare happened where there was going to be a lot of casualties even within the trenches, the soldiers still had to come out of the trenches and go and gain ground the old-fashioned hard way. But taking a look at the trench fare, a lot of times in order to gain ground, they would just dig more trenches. So perhaps in the back you would have reserve trenches and your company headquarters dugout where your officers would be. And then you'd have your first set of dugouts and trenches where you'd have a lot of support where most of your soldiers would probably stay for protections from explosions in the front. But then you'd have to go between the front and the back trenches, so you would actually have a trench, a communication trench dug between the first and the last. Next, you're going to have the forward listening posts and the forward trench. and that 4 listening posts would go into what was called no man's land, the land between the trenches on the Western Front where, say, the Great Britain and French troops were, versus the no man's land where on the opposite side you'd have the Austro-Hungarians and the German trenches. So why did they dig these trenches? What new weapons were being used in World War I? Well, the machine guns were mowing down the traditional lines of battle. So you couldn't form your soldiers into lines of battle. They'd be mowed down by machine guns and the other great weapons. So they were put into trenches for that matter. Another matter was the poison gas that would also be used, that would float over across the no man's land and onto the soldiers. Now, that doesn't mean that being in a trench would protect you from the poison gas. A lot of times they would still have to put on their gas masks, but before that poison could come down into the trenches, there was enough time for the men to see that on the no man's land above, the poison was floating. So trench warfare was still extremely tough, but it did help relieve some of the problems of the machine guns and poison gases. However, we also had an industrial revolution that brought new weapons as well, such as the submarine, the airplane, and the tank. And here's a picture of some of the early tanks that were being used in World War I. You can see your men in some of the forward trenches in the front and center, and then right next to them would be some of their earliest tanks. Next, you also see now men getting into the no man's land with their weapons drawn, and they are wearing gas masks to protect them from the poisonous gases, particularly the most lethal one that was being used in World War I at the time that was now outlawed is mustard gas. We also have had airplanes around for about a generation, around the 1890s to the early 1900s. Airplanes were a luxury item. They were still trying to be learned how to be useful. But by the time 20 years passes and we start off into 1914, 1915, airplanes are now economical enough that the military could actually use them for fighting forces, maybe perhaps for scouting. So airplanes were actually used quite extensively in World War I. And then, of course, if you are trying to stop shipments from Allies, if you're trying to stop troop movements from Allies, the German U-boats, their submarines, were quite effective in disrupting shipping lanes and passages of troop movements from one front to the other. So submarines are being quite useful in World War I, particularly on the Axis levels, on the Central Powers, and where you have Germans and Austro-Hungarians using the U-boats to their big effectiveness. And here is a picture of some machine guns from World War I, where we actually see a signal corps using some of the machine guns in the back of their trench lines, which would become more effective even so in the later wars. We do see in some earlier wars how effective and deadly a machine gun could become, but by World War I, we've had machine guns around for a couple of generations now, so the machine gun was just mowing down rows and rows of soldiers until trench warfare became the norm. So with World War I, the Great War, what were the results? Eventually, Germany surrenders. They just had too many people they were at war at. The Allies then impose the Treaty of Versailles upon Germany. It was a major peace treaty of World War I. Wilson then brought his 14-point plan from the United States to the Treaty of Versailles, and hoping that in the peace conference, the 14-point plan was intended to undo all of the past alliances, because the biggest problem of World War I was that because of one assassination, 2 countries that went to war brought all of the other countries into the war simply because of the alliances that they had. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States at the time, wanted to be able to bust up this particular mania and be able to bring a more lasting peace between the nations in Europe. So what were some of the casualties from World War I? Well, we had over 65 million troops mobilized by all of the countries. And of those 65 million, in World War I, we lost approximately 8.5 million troops to death. and over 21 million troops were wounded. The total missing or POWs would be almost 8 million. So if you do the math, roughly half of all troops mobilized by World War I were either killed, wounded, or as of today, still missing. But what was the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I? World War I ended at 11 a.m. on the 11th of the 11th month, November, in 1918. In 1919, Lord George of England, Orlando of Italy, Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson from the United States met to discuss how Germany was to be made to pay for the damage World War I had caused. And so Woodrow Wilson of the United States had devised a 14-point plan that he believed would bring stability to Europe. Now, Germany expected a treaty based on these 14 points. However, negotiations between these big four did not go smoothly. Wilson was looking for an everlasting peace, and therefore that's what his 14 points were written to do. However, the French, who had most of the Western Front in their country, were looking for reparations. They wanted the defeated nations to be punished severely, and they believed Wilson's plan was too lenient. The European victors also wanted to weaken Germany to make sure they never went to war again, and they also wanted to enhance their own military powers and standing in the world. Therefore, the Treaty of Versailles was structured to punish Germany and included the war guilt clause, which was a feature to where Germany accepted the responsibility for starting the war. Now, remember, the war had started because of the spark, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, where the Bosnians and the Serbians were fighting, and Austria-Hungary comes in against the Serbians and declares war. But in the Treaty of Versailles, it was signed that Germany accepts the responsibility for starting World War I. So what was the war guilt clause? Well, Germany has reparations to pay. They also now are being military restricted. Their army can only be up to 100,000 soldiers. They're not allowed an air force. They're not allowed submarines. The Rhineland that they had decided to take over was completely demilitarized. And of course, Germany loses territory towards France in the west, and they lose some of the Sudetenland in the east. Now, the League of Nations was formed, but it was not very successful. And I do have a video that talks about these uncertain times between 1919 and 1939, and a lot of it concentrates on how the League of Nations doesn't quite do what the 14 points plan of Woodrow Wilson asked it to do. First, because of all those reparations in the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations finds itself very weak and almost unstructured. Not all of the major powers were even members of the League. In fact, the U.S. that formed the League of Nations chose not to join. Now, granted, the 14-point plan of Woodrow Wilson's was not being followed from the start, and Woodrow Wilson, shortly after this point in time, was no longer president. Germany and Russia were not allowed to join. We still wanted to punish Germany, and with the rise of communism in Russia, they didn't want to allow Russia to join the League of Nations. Japan and Italy withdrew almost immediately. After all, when we get to our time of uncertainty in the 1920s and in the early 1930s, you start seeing a dictatorial rule with Mussolini in Italy and with Emperor Hirohito in Japan. And the League had no authority or influence in international affairs. The League of Nations was created to have authority and influence in international affairs. And as they saw in this time of uncertainty, nobody was allowing them the authority. And therefore, any laws that they had made with their Treaty of Versailles and with the 14-point plan, they could not enforce them. Thank you so much for stopping by to learn a little bit more about World War I. If you'd like me to get in particular into battles, or maybe perhaps into biographies of people who were part of World War I, leave a comment down below. Who would you like to learn about, or what sort of battles would you like to learn about? And as always, I thank you for stopping by.